Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on combating human trafficking through collaboration. I'm Ariel Altman from the Civil Division of the National Legal Aid and Defender Association. All of us at NLADA are thrilled to be joined today by leadership from the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit at the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, by experts from both the Civil Legal Aid and Public Defender offices, and by other prominent leaders in the anti-trafficking movement. Our presentations today will cover the types of legal services survivors of human trafficking need, how to identify when civil or criminal clients may be victims of trafficking, successful models for collaborating with law enforcement while maintaining a victim-centered approach, and opportunities for working with the Civil Rights Division to fight against human trafficking in your communities. We want to thank all today's presenters, which include Hillary Axum, Director of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit at the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. From Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, we'll be hearing from Lelia Satere, Senior Attorney of the Ron Olson Justice Center at LAFLA, Joanne Lee, Directing Attorney at LAFLA's Asian and Pacific Islander Outreach Project, Stephanie Richard, Director of Policy and Legal Services at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Human Trafficking, or CAST as many of you know it, and Zoe Root, Senior Policy Counsel at the Justice Programs Office and an adjunct instructor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. And today, Zoe will also be speaking about her former experience as a supervising attorney at the Bronx Defenders. We've included bios for all of our speakers towards the end of this presentation, and all have graciously offered to serve as a resource after the webinar and included their email addresses on the bio slides as well. Before we get started, just a few logistical items to share. First, we should have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and our speakers will respond to as many questions at the end as time allows. Everyone should also have been able to access the presentation slides as well as 9 attachments from LAFLA, and we'll also be posting these documents on the webinar page of the NLADA website tomorrow. And finally, we'll be recording this webinar and plan on posting it to the NLADA website in the next couple of weeks. You can look out for that. Thank you again to all of our speakers and all of our participants joining us today. And now I'm going to pass it over to Hillary.
Thank you very much. This is Hillary Axum from DOJ's Civil Rights Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion. It's wonderful to connect with so many civil legal aid providers and defenders out there because you are serving the exact kind of vulnerable and at-risk communities who tend to be overrepresented among human trafficking victims. So you folks are in a really ideal position to be attuned to trafficking indicators and possibly detect those indicators and help us seek justice on behalf of human trafficking victims. It's a crime that essentially proliferates because it's a crime that targets vulnerable individuals, those who are reluctant to come forward and seek help from authorities, and those who may not be in a position to self-identify at all. So having folks who are trusted and in contact and communication with the vulnerable sectors of our communities is really a key to detecting human trafficking and being in a position to seek justice on behalf of trafficking victims. So I just want to give a quick overview of what human trafficking is under federal criminal statutes, what my unit does, and what are some of the opportunities out there to identify human trafficking victims, and finally, how we can collaborate between law enforcement and the civil legal aid and defender community to work together to bring victims forward and stabilize them and kind of seek to vindicate their rights and hold perpetrators accountable. So the reason I'm going to pause and define human trafficking under the federal criminal laws is that there are many different definitions of human trafficking out there. There are international treaties, there are state criminal laws, there are civil laws. So just to be sure we're all on the same page, and that's not even counting the media imagery and the kind of popular cultural imagery of what human trafficking is. So just to be sure, we are speaking the same language. When I am talking about human trafficking, I'm talking about a crime of exploitation that involves compelling or coercing another person for labor, services, or commercial sex. Now, when the person is a minor, there is no requirement that we prove the coercion. It's sort of a presumed coercion because of the inherent vulnerability of a minor. But there is often coercive conduct, and from the perspective of a federal criminal prosecutor, we want to prove it when it exists because it enhances the penalty. So even though there's no coercion requirement, it's still highly relevant to look for coercive conduct when you have minors. But the important thing to emphasize here is that the essence of the crime is one of exploitation, of using coercive means to compel a person's labor, services, or commercial sex. I emphasize that because in some international contexts, there's a lot of talk of organ trafficking, plural marriage, forced adoptions, a lot of other exploitative relationships that are not squarely within the U.S. criminal laws. And just another note, my unit focuses on forced labor, sex trafficking of adults by force, bribe, coercion, and international sex trafficking. There's another part of the Department of Justice, the Criminal Division's Child Exploitation and Obscenity section, that focuses on sex trafficking of minors, primarily in the domestic context. So it's a very broad array of crimes rolled into that term, human trafficking, but I'm focusing on that crime of exploitation, as I described, and primarily on the coercion-based iterations of that crime, forced labor, sex trafficking of adults by force, bribe, coercion, and international sex trafficking. So even within that narrower slice of trafficking, there are plenty of variations. The coercion that I'm talking about can be subtle or overt. It can be physical or psychological. And just to dispel a common myth/misconception, it does not need to involve any physical force or physical restraint, and it does not need to involve any transportation or movement of any kind, not transnational, not interstate. You can technically traffic somebody right where they are. Now, of course, you get somebody out of their familiar surroundings, isolated from their family, isolated from their community, they're going to be more vulnerable. They're going to be disoriented. They're going to have fewer places to turn. They're going to be more dependent on the trafficker who got them into those unfamiliar surroundings. That plays a huge part with international victims who are in a foreign country. They don't understand the language, the laws. They don't have identification papers necessarily, or if they do, they don't know whether they need additional identification. These kinds of dislocating, disorienting factors can play a huge part in the vulnerability, but there is no requirement that you move a person anywhere. So that's just to dispel that, because you will hear prosecutors' offices, governmental offices, media reports, speak of a big human trafficking ring or a huge human trafficking arrest, enforcement action, takedown, and when you read the details, they're actually talking about smuggling or interstate transportation for prostitution. None of that is trafficking under federal criminal laws unless there's the coerced labor, services, or commercial sex. So another thing I want to emphasize about the variety, the different iterations of this crime, is the diversity of the victims. You'll hear me use female pronouns a lot, and the vast majority of the victims who we have identified are female, but there are plenty of male victims as well, and they can be exploited for labor or commercial sex. Once again, a vulnerability is identified and exploited, so it could be extreme poverty and debt and undocumented immigration status, and male victims can be extremely reluctant to cooperate, extremely reluctant to confide that they were afraid. The first forced labor victims I ever worked with was in a case in Buffalo, New York, shortly after the TVPA was passed, and they were undocumented Mexican nationals, and the person who trafficked them was a woman who was about 5'1" and weighed about 90 pounds, and it was terrifying for them to confide how afraid they were of her and her threats. But she had complete control over them, along with her co-conspirators who helped create the climate of fear. But it was terrifying for them to be starved and exhausted and threatened with deportation and isolated and threatened with physical harm and harm to their families, and to confide how afraid they were was a very difficult process. So don't expect that these victims that you're looking for will necessarily be female. They also, if they're foreign victims, they're not necessarily undocumented foreign victims. We have people who enter the United States as guest workers on a fully legal visa, and then they're manipulated. Either they're told that their visa is no good, or the trafficker compels them to do another job in violation of the terms of their visa, and then tells them, oh, you've violated your visa, now you have to pay me this extra fee to renew it. And the manipulation of their fear of coming out of status, of the mounting insurmountable debts, is used to manipulate and compel them. So we've had J1 visa holders who came as foreign exchange students for summer jobs. We've had H2A, H2B, all kinds of different lawfully admitted guest workers then compelled into servitude and forced labor. And the traffickers are equally diverse, anything from a single household holding the domestic servant, sometimes who's a member of their own family that they're controlling, a niece or cousin, all the way on up to extremely well-organized transnational criminal organizations. But in between, we have loosely affiliated networks of cousins and neighbors. You know, it kind of goes against the stereotype of like a Mexican cartel that's a command and control with a central capo at the head of everything ordering operations. There's a bit of a narrative out there that the highly sophisticated Mexican drug cartels are now into human trafficking. Realistically, what we've seen is more loosely affiliated networks, kind of operating as a trafficking enterprise, but also using loose affiliations with smuggling networks and other criminal activity, but not a sophisticated, structured conspiracy like you might expect in the stereotypical iteration of transnational criminal organizations. But beneath all this variation and diversity, the common thread, as I've said, is finding a vulnerability and manipulating it. And that's where the legal aid and defender community comes in, is because these vulnerabilities often take the form of some kind of legal exposure, some kind of potential criminal exposure, or a significant problem in the person's life. It could manifest as an insurmountable debt to an employer where they feel that they've mortgaged their home and harm will come to their family if they don't pay it off, or an immigration problem that they can't see their way around and somebody is, you know, threatening them with deportation or threatening to separate them from their children. It can be drug addiction, which of course comes with often a history of drug arrests. We'll have victims who are addicted to opioids, and as victims have testified in our trafficking cases, the pain of opiate withdrawal, physically, physiologically, and psychologically speaking, is worse than death. They describe it that way, like that's not a metaphor. They would rather die than face that. So the trafficker knows this and can titrate just the right amount of opioids to stave off the withdrawal symptoms, but not give the victim that high that she is now addicted to and chasing. Therefore, the trafficker can compel her to do anything he commands for the next 3 hours because he's taken all her money and she has nowhere else to get that next high. It's what we call a chemical tether, and it's highly effective. It's a weaponized use of a substance addiction to compel and coerce a vulnerable person. And these things look like what a prosecutor would call baggage or, cross-examination fodder, vulnerabilities as a witness, but they're the vulnerabilities that make them an actual trafficking victim too. So if you're seeing somebody who is drug addicted, and they may just describe this as, well, they owe a debt to the person who provides them their drugs, and that's why they can't leave him. But if you're seeing somebody who's engaged in prostitution and addicted to drugs, and there's another person in the picture who is both purveying the drugs and directing the prostitution activity, that's a potential red flag that somebody has spotted that vulnerability and manipulated it to compel them into prostitution, thereby making it trafficking. The fear of homelessness, debt, repossession of the family lands, all of these things similarly can be manipulated as vulnerabilities. And the TVPA is very broad. It reaches any form of serious harm, whether financial, psychological, or reputational. That means we've seen victims who come from a traditional background compelled to perform a sex act and then essentially extorted to accede to the trafficker's demands under threat of exposing their conduct to their family, even if that conduct was compelled against their will in the first place. So we recently prosecuted a case in Florida where the victims were J1 summer exchange students from Kazakhstan. They came from traditional backgrounds, and they were compelled into prostitution. They were deceived, falsely promised jobs in a yoga studio, yet here there's no yoga studio. They have no other way to support themselves. Trafficker just wears them down until they eventually relent to performing these exotic massages, that they're traumatized enough by having to massage men and then realizing that sex acts are expected of them, and that threat of exposing to their families that they even were in contact with men in a massage kind of context, let alone the sex act, was enough to continue compelling them with that threat of reputational harm. So we're looking for really a vast array of coercive schemes. Anything that cuts the victim off from seeking alternative ways of supporting him or herself, anything that cuts them off from having another place to go live. If you see that cycle of dependency where somebody has made themselves the sole source of housing and use that to compel somebody, or the sole source of drugs, anything like that, whether it's the undocumented immigration status, the lack of a home to go to. And remember, the standard is really whether the victim has a safe alternative. So if a victim comes from a severely abusive background and has fled that circumstance, and trafficker offers a home to that person and then compels her to perform commercial sex acts or to perform labor, and is threatening her that he's going to put her back out and send her back home, if that home she comes from involves being beaten by her father and raped by her uncle, the legal standard of would a reasonable person in that victim's circumstances feel that they could leave without facing serious harm. So you have to look at the circumstances when a trafficker is threatening something. What are the adverse consequences that the person fears? And coming from a background with serious vulnerabilities like that, with a prior history of trauma, is really significant. So that's kind of what we're looking for. If you see the next slide, I kind of go through a lot of different contexts, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I just want to emphasize this because I think the stereotypical concept of what sex trafficking looks like is a back page ad and a customer comes to a hotel for a single sex act with a victim who's either underage or is compelled. It actually is a lot more complicated than that. Online advertising is definitely a big part of it. Number one, it's not just back page. There are thousands of online message boards with a wide spectrum in terms of degrees of sketchiness and how open they are about the sex acts that are being purveyed there. There's also use of other social media for recruitment that's very separate from the online platforms that's used to advertise the victims. But apart from that kind of cyber dimension to it, there's plenty of sex trafficking going on in trailers that are set up at migrant labor camps, in casinos, in massage parlors, cantinas, nightclubs, karaoke bars. There's fake modeling agencies luring people into the United States from Eastern Europe and Central Asia in pursuit of modeling opportunities. There's fake cultural exchange programs where people are going to perform folkloric dance and really it's exotic dance flash. If you want to work down your debt faster, then you can prostitute on the side. It just is infinite in its variations. So don't want anyone out there thinking they're looking for just that one model of online advertising for individual sex acts in a motel or alcohol delivery situation. Similarly, labor trafficking. I think there's some classic images of a garment factory or an agricultural field, but it is so diverse. We're talking hospitality, tourist, service industries, construction crews, restaurant and bar personnel, a lot of home health aides and elder care workers, traveling sales crews, and then don't forget agricultural processing as well as the harvesting. There's a lot of plants that are canning fish or packing eggs, sanitizing meats. It goes beyond just the harvesting. So I think that's just really important in terms of where you're looking for these clients you may have, whether in an indigent criminal defense setting or in a civil legal aid setting. They could have experienced mistreatment from a boss or are in a situation of fear of adverse consequences through some kind of compelled work or sexual services. And it could look very, very different depending on the circumstances. And they're not necessarily in a position to connect the dots and identify themselves as a victim. We are the ones as attorneys who are able to connect those dots. Things that are used as threats against them, they may not know those are threats because they may believe them to be true. Like people will hold workers in an isolated setting and say that it's such a dangerous neighborhood that this gang will, rape you and beat you to a pulp if you step foot outside. We know that's not true because the traffickers and their associates come and go. If we're in a position to see that that's not like a good faith warning for somebody's safety, we may have to connect the dots and say this is a deliberate manipulative scheme to isolate and compel and coerce that individual client you may encounter wouldn't necessarily recognize because they have no reason to doubt the warnings they're getting. So just be attuned to that. So what does my unit do? We're the ones who partner with U.S. attorneys' offices around the country to prosecute cases involving these forms of forced labor and sex trafficking by force, fraud, coercion. We focus on the novel, complex, multi-jurisdictional, and international cases, but we really are there as a partner and a backstop with U.S. attorneys' offices. There are some USAOs that have done dozens of these cases and others that are still doing their first case or their first case of a certain type, like they've never done a foreign victim case or they've never done a nonviolent coercion case or a drug-based coercion case. So by us being involved in so many cases, we're able to function as sort of consolidated expertise of the federal prosecution community and also to coordinate across the many investigative agencies involved in this. Many of our cases involve some combination of FBI, ICE Homeland Security, diplomatic security, Department of Labor, just off the bat as really common ones, plus, depending on the circumstances, IRS. We've had postal inspectors. This is a crime that has many different angles and can be identified in so many different ways that coordinating the multi-district and multi-agency aspects of it is a really important role that was identified. That's why we consolidated this specialized unit to kind of coordinate among the many investigations and prosecutions nationwide. We also lead enforcement initiatives designed to create coordination structures for complex cases, and we serve as departmental experts guiding policy priorities and things like that. One issue of great interest to the victim, survivor, advocate community is the question of criminal exposure of trafficking victims. And, as the departmental subject matter experts, we're, working to come up with a workable solution there so that victims are not improperly prosecuted for conduct they're compelled to perform by their traffickers, and striking the right procedural and substantive balance in the standard there to work with prosecutors around the country, because one of our main priorities as HTPU is to advance survivor-centered best practices. And I put a slide in here just defining that. We think it's extremely important to take a survivor-centered approach, which focuses on vindicating the rights of the survivor, empowering the survivor as an active participant in the criminal justice process, recognizing incidents or interactions with the criminal justice process that can be re-traumatizing, seeking to collaborate with survivors and their representatives to make participation in the criminal justice process as empowering as possible, with a view towards vindicating the individual rights of the survivor, while also maintaining appropriate boundaries, in the sense that it would ill-serve survivors to have them confused about whether the government and the prosecution team represents them. We want to be really clear that their attorneys and their advocates represent them. We represent the people and the community and the rule of law and the concept that these trafficking crimes are terribly harmful to our communities and the rule of law, as well as to the individual survivor. So I will be the first to admit on behalf of law enforcement that we all have a long way to go. Things happen all the time that I do not consider to be consistent with survivor-centered best practices, and my unit is working really hard to get out in front of that and be a voice within law enforcement that you can't go kick down doors and put handcuffs on a victim and then back up and expect her to cooperate. Like, you have to kind of go in with a victim-centered, survivor-centered perspective up front. Now, there are fine lines between victims and perpetrators. Sometimes it's impossible to tell going in who is who. Just balancing the investigative needs and the security aspects of the investigation with the importance of having a survivor-centered approach, kind of mediating that is one of the really important things we do. In addition to advancing survivor-centered strategies, as I've outlined, we also think it's critically important to advance trauma-informed strategies. I've flagged a few points in the slides of what that entails, but most importantly, I think in the law enforcement community, there are stereotypes of what a crime victim looks like, how a person presents him or herself, what kind of demeanor to expect from a crime victim. And basically, in the trafficking context, all of that is 180 degrees opposite from what you would expect. There's a kind of stereotype that a victim will cry out for help and be grateful for help, and that is just not the way it goes down with trafficking victims. They have the trauma bonding they experience, the cognitive and neurobiological effects of trauma make it extremely difficult to articulate in any kind of chronological, coherent manner their experience, which is going to result in inconsistencies. It requires us to take a patient, persistent, trauma-informed, victim-centered approach to how to stabilize the traumatized individual and how to gradually bridge that gap between the law enforcement perspective and where the person is. And that's a form of expertise that we think is really important, and that my unit really tries to advance with our law enforcement partners nationwide, just the importance of rapport building and stabilizing as a key part not only of the rights-based approach on behalf of the survivor, but also as essential to our law enforcement function, because you're not going to have an effective witness unless you stabilize the person as a human being. So this is kind of the role my unit plays, and this is why I think it's so important that we're having this conversation, because I think the legal aid and defender community is in such a great position working with vulnerable individuals who have criminal exposure, who have legal problems in their lives, whether it's poverty-related, immigration-related, workplace-related, family law, If anybody is experiencing a distress where the instability in their parental rights situation, a protective restraining order, domestic violence situation, or harassment, mistreatment, abuse in the workplace situation, in addition to their criminal exposure from prior prostitution, from prior drug use, these are all vulnerabilities that are manipulated by traffickers. So I want to thank you in advance for this opportunity to start this conversation. I've put in the slides how to contact my unit, and we are just really looking forward to working together to talk about instances where the indicators of these vulnerabilities may present themselves in your work and how we can work together to initiate law enforcement investigations when appropriate and really work together to try to seek justice on behalf of trafficking victims and survivors. I think I'm just about out of time, so I'm about to turn it over to my LAFLA colleagues, but I will look forward to taking questions after all the presentations. Thank you.
Great, so thank you so much. We're going to turn it over to our presenters from LAFLA now. Dahlia and Joanne, I'll go ahead and unmute you so that you'll be able to join us.
Thank you so much. This is Dahlia. I'm going to talk a little bit about LAFLA's approach to serving human trafficking survivors. So LAFLA provides a wide, if you go to the next slide, LAFLA provides a wide range of free legal services for low-income persons in general. And we have over 100 staff, 5 different offices in Los Angeles, as well as legal clinics in the courthouses and in various ethnic communities. I'm going to be reviewing the model that is being adopted by LAFLA to increase collaboration amongst staff in general and between different legal service areas. Next slide. So currently at LAFLA, human trafficking is predominantly identified in the immigration context. Therefore, all the immigration advocates are trained on human trafficking, and they're also familiar with a large host and wide range of immigration remedies so that they may pursue the best remedy suited for the client. For example, it's not uncommon for a client to seek services, for example, seeking asylum relief, but then because we've been trained, we may discover that the client also is a human trafficking survivor, which completely changes the course of legal services as well as social services that will be provided. For example, most recently, we had a client walk into one of our DV clinics in the courthouse in Long Beach to get a restraining order against, and it was an LGBT client, against his abusive husband who had made him have sex with other men in exchange for drugs. Because we're trained on human trafficking, we were able to flag that besides domestic violence, there's also human trafficking involved, and determine that the best remedy would be still to get a restraining order, but instead of, for example, pursuing a T visa, that we would pursue the Violence Against Women Act because that was less traumatic for the client and involved, it was more secure for the client. But then because he was a human trafficking survivor, we then made all the proper referrals to human trafficking specific social services. Next slide. Once we've identified a client as a human trafficking victim or survivor, the client really needs more than one person, and to move from being a victim to a survivor, clients really need more than one person to serve the client as a whole. You need a multidisciplinary approach and a lot of collaboration. So, for example, at Legal Aid, we have an internal referral system by which we can refer the client within the agency to meet all of the client's legal needs. We realize that for smaller, more specialized agencies, it's crucial to create those partnerships with other agencies continuously and really before engaging with a human trafficking survivor or victim, so that the client can be referred seamlessly. For example, a few years ago, there was a big case in Los Angeles, the Guatemalan sex trafficking case that ended up getting a conviction for 5 defendants and dozens of victims, female victims from Central America, who'd been trafficked across the U.S.-Mexico border, threatened, raped, compelled into prostitution with witchcraft. Once the clients were identified, legal aid was able to collaborate with the U.S. attorney and represent the victims as victim advocates in federal criminal court, assisting with the victim statement, for example, assisting with explaining the process to the client, and also making sure that the clients receive restitution. We then internally assisted the clients with T visas for them as well as their family members. Also internally, we were able to provide family law services for them. Some of them needed annulments of marriages or later divorces and custody for some of the clients who had escaped and then entered into a relationship with John, who became abusive. And then, of course, providing government benefits through our government benefits unit. All right, next. So to increase capacity, LAFLA a few years ago created a new model. We created work groups whereby we combined our traditional units, which had been specializing in one kind of legal discipline, to create a more holistic working team. So for example, we combined family law and immigration law into one work group that meets every 2 weeks for training purposes and for case review, whereby we all get a breadth of information on various different remedies and also on human trafficking cases. So with this model, advocates are cross-trained and are therefore better able to issue, spot, and provide holistic services to many vulnerable populations, including human trafficking. In our Asian Pacific Islander project, similarly, we combined family law, immigration, and various community clinics. In economic stability, for example, we combined government benefits and employment law, to which we then train on human trafficking as well. Next slide, please. And so really the more staff going all the way from reception to volunteers are trained on human trafficking, the wider we can cast the net for identifying and then serving human trafficking victims. So in order to prepare to have a holistic model to serving human trafficking, it's important to train staff and to partner with NGOs to make sure that cultural and linguistic resources are available for clients, and to prepare a referral list beforehand with local referrals that are culturally sensitive. So for the training aspect, we suggest a multi-level human trafficking identification approach. So the first prong to the approach is to train all those who are on the front lines on human trafficking, and specifically on a red flags checklist. So we provide the red flags checklist in the resource section for you to review. There are several different kinds of checklists, and you can look at them and determine which one would be most suitable for your program. But we use the red flag checklist for the DV clinics, the workers' rights clinics, our reception, as well as the medical staff at our medical legal partnership. And really the red flag checklist is a guide to help anybody coming into contact with a potential trafficking victim to recognize possible signs of trafficking. Not that that means that the person is a trafficking survivor, but that it's a red flag that says, okay, we need to now continue screening. So once a red flag has been identified, the case is then referred to an advocate who's been trained more thoroughly on human trafficking and a trauma-informed approach, who will then engage in a face-to-face, more detailed screening, which we will talk about in the next slide. Also at Legal Aid, we have a model by which we have an attorney of the day from our Supporting Families work group who can be called upon at any time by anybody in the entire foundation to assist with further screening. Next slide. Yeah, so here, this is an amazing flow chart that was created by the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center, which we've also included in the resources in case it's too small for you to see all the details of it. But we strive to follow this model. So at the very front line is, again, the red flags checklist. So if it is determined that a client, that a red flag is present, we would then go to the next level and screen the client. Before doing that, if the client is with somebody, it is of utmost importance to make sure that the client is interviewed alone without the presence of the other person, since the other person might be a perpetrator. Next, it's crucial to determine what language needs the client has, and we're going to go more into detail about our LEP policy in a bit. And then we've also attached in the resources the screening tools that is suggested and that we're adopting. And through that screening tool, we're then able to determine if further services need to be made and if somebody is a trafficking survivor. And this screening tool is actually really amazing. It consists of 8 questions that focus on the legal elements of trafficking, which include force, fraud, and coercion, as well as the ends of forced labor or commercial sex. And the 8 questions are trauma-informed. They're not shaming questions, and they almost normalize the client's experience, which makes it easier to create rapport with a client, to create a trust relationship. So, for example, instead of asking the client, have you ever engaged in prostitution, or have you ever engaged in commercial sex, or are you a sex worker, the question is more like, I'm going to read from the screening tool. So one of the questions is, sometimes people are hurt or threatened, or threats are made to their family or loved ones, or they're forced to do things they do not want to do in order to make money for someone else, or to pay off a debt to them. Have you ever experienced this, or are you in a situation where you think this could happen? So as you see, the question is really trauma sensitive, and all 8 questions are like that. So if the client answers no to any of these questions, we still will offer human trafficking resources, either in writing or verbally. But if the client answers yes to any of those questions, then we will focus on safety and offer to connect them to human trafficking resources immediately, either through the human trafficking hotline or locally to CAST hotline, or to other shelters, or refer them to one of the relevant legal service providers within LAFLA. That, of course, is on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the client's needs are. Next. So we found that the most natural progression besides our immigration advocates would be to start with providing training to advocates in our family law unit or family law arena and domestic violence arena, because there's a lot of intersectionality between domestic violence and human trafficking. And this could be a whole training on its own. But just the very basics, we've attached resources, including a human trafficking power and control wheel that kind of shows the similarities between human trafficking and domestic violence and shows where those two could intersect and overlap. Domestic violence can be a push factor into human trafficking because where a domestic violence victim is unsupported, one way for them to escape is getting into another relationship that might turn into a human trafficking relationship. Or if a human trafficking victim is not properly supported, they also may be prone to entering into a domestic violence relationship because they may have low self-esteem and may not be able to themselves see the red flags for human trafficking. So unfortunately, oftentimes when human trafficking goes undetected, it will be to the detriment of the client. For example, in a custody situation, in the family law arena, if unidentified, a human trafficking victim may be portrayed by the opposing party, for example, as the bad parent because they may have a prostitution record. And if human trafficking is not identified and brought up in court, that the opposing party is a trafficker who's forcing the client into prostitution, she may end up losing her child in a custody situation. So it's really important, even if the client doesn't need, for example, immigration services for human trafficking, it's still critical for us in all the different legal arenas to identify human trafficking. On the next slide, there are some indicators which I think you can mostly review on your own on how to detect human trafficking within an abusive relationship. Just in the interest of time, we're going to continue to the next section. Also, we found that there's a lot of intersectionality between our asylum seeker population or refugee population and human trafficking. Oftentimes, people escaping from their home countries because of gang violence, civil unrest, or a war, or persecution, become very vulnerable to human trafficking. In those situations, when we identify the client, we then are able to apply for multiple forms of relief. That may include asylum, but also the T visa. For example, we recently had a client, a minor escape from the Northern Triangle, who had escaped gang violence and initially had been referred to us for an asylum case. But in the course of interviewing him, we were able to determine that at the border, he had fallen into the hands of a gang in Mexico who had then attempted to traffic the client into the United States for labor and sex purposes. And so we were, in addition to filing for asylum, preserving that time, we were also able to apply for a T visa, which fortunately was granted. Also in the employment arena, it is really critical to train persons in the workers' rights clinics, for example. For example, we recently had a client at our clinic who had been a hotel industry worker who had been raped by her supervisor and forced to work many more hours for less pay. The union organizer had encouraged her to come forward and to file for a wage and hour claim. And luckily, the advocate at the workers' rights clinic had been trained on the red flags and noticed that some of the red flags were present. For example, the client was fearful of her supervisor, feared that he would harm her or her family if she talked about what had happened. He made her pay cash from the checks that he gave her. And in addition, she was very vulnerable because she was undocumented. We were able to further screen that client and determine that, yes, she was a human trafficking survivor, and made the proper referrals to human trafficking social service organization to support her with counseling, with government benefits, assistance, and we were able to report the case to the Department of Labor, who certified her as a trafficking victim, and we're currently applying for a T visa for her. So that was another successful collaboration between our different units. Next. In our medical legal partnerships, we have also begun training healthcare providers. Really, it's often medical service providers who come into contact with human trafficking survivors, and so often they are not identified. Here in this slide, we've listed some potential red flags and indicators for medical providers where they may be able to identify human trafficking and then refer them for further assessments. For example, recently, LAFLA assisted a client who had been a victim of sex trafficking. The client attempted to commit suicide and threw herself out of an apartment building from the third-story balcony. And she fell, but she did not die, but lost consciousness. The traffickers then picked her up, took her back to the room, and because she was unconscious, they did call 911. 911 came, took the client to the emergency. The client at this point was awake but had no idea what was going on. The emergency team then transferred her to Kaiser Permanente because the traffickers then showed up and explained that that they had enrolled her in Kaiser Permanente, where they had enrolled all of their sex workers. At Kaiser, she was operated. She received spinal cord surgery. However, nobody, neither at the emergency nor at Kaiser, ever suspected that she was a sex trafficking survivor. And so this shows how crucial it is to engage in our communities and to train medical service providers and to provide resources for them so that we could form proper collaborations and identify trafficking survivors. Next. As I talked about before, it's really important that in every single interaction with our clients that we have a trauma-informed relationship. Next slide. And we really see more and more how the attorney-client relationship, although it's not often thought about as a therapeutic relationship, that it actually can be very healing if we engage with our clients properly through a client-centered and trauma-informed approach. Really, through all our relationships in our lives, we have opportunities to create trust bonds and to create healing, but particularly with our very vulnerable clients, the way we engage with them, the way we show up for them, the way we speak with them, the way we look at them in the eye, the way we make time and space for them. In some situations, it might be the only time where, somebody, as we're seen as advocates as somebody in the position of power, it might be the first time that somebody who's seen in the position of power is really engaging with a client in a respectful manner where we see them as a human being. Next. So in the client-centered approach, the most important aspect first to stress is confidentiality. That's the first level in which trust can be created. Next, it's important to create a safe space. That can include removing everybody else from a room so that the client can be screened in private, making sure that nobody else can hear the discussion, as well as little things such as allowing the person to choose where they sit. That includes meeting their other physical needs, offering them snacks and drinks, for example. Oftentimes, trafficking survivors have experienced deprivation of their basic needs. So a simple act of, offering them Kleenex, offering them breaks, something to drink, supports us in building trust. The way we carry ourselves, our body's position, avoiding crossing our arms, being open, and sometimes it's useful even before meeting with a client for ourselves to kind of engage in some sort of like a meditation or a mindfulness practice so that we ourselves check in with ourselves to make sure that we are also in the position to receive somebody and receive somebody's trauma so that we can engage with them meaningfully. Engaging in eye contact, in keeping and maintaining a calm tone, for example. Also really important not to criticize the exploiter. I think sometimes it's really easy for us to, have being outraged at the exploiter or the trafficker, but oftentimes there's a really delicate psychological bond between the trafficker and the survivor. And it could damage our trust if we talk disparagingly about the exploiter. And then really important to use empathetic language. So instead of, and I know me too, oftentimes we might be so, shocked that it's easy to say something like, oh my God, that's terrible, but instead saying something more empathetic, like, I notice you're tearing up, let me know if you need to take a break. I'm here to listen to you. And really also using this as an opportunity for resilience building. I often say things like, well, you are so strong. You are here now, and, we're going to work together. You could show me what's going to help you best in creating more safety for you and moving forward for you. But you already are so strong. You just keep stressing their resilience. And then also making sure that we're prepared with some stress management techniques in case they do fall into a trauma reaction. And we don't have time to go into that right now, but there's some, great stress management exercises you could look up, some breathing techniques, and some other tools that we can be prepared with beforehand. Again, in the trauma-informed principles includes empathy, which you already covered, and then also just recognizing all types of trauma. The client might not just be experiencing human trafficking. They may have had a long history of other traumas, including poverty, domestic violence, for example, and it's important for us to know how to cope with all of those and help the client cope. Very important are cultural and linguistic appropriateness, because that assists in developing trust, and my colleague Joanne is going to go into that momentarily. Again, stressing the physical, emotional, and safety, not just for the client, but also for us. That includes making sure that we have self-care techniques for ourselves, because it can get pretty stressful and it becomes easy for us to shut off when we're encountering super traumatic stories over and over again. And another way to help the survivor rebuild a sense of control and empowerment, which had been taken away from them, is through education, so psychoeducation, which means explaining to them the entire legal process, and that might take more than once. Sometimes I feel like I've explained the legal process and what we're doing to the client in their own language, on their own level, and in the end they still may be confused as to where we are in the legal process. So having patience and being open to explaining that to them over and over again. And then also very critical is to give them choice. You know, are you ready to report to law enforcement? Do you want to go forward with a restraining order? And by giving them choice, that also creates resilience. I'm going to hand it over to Joanne now to talk about language access.
Hi everyone, this is Joanne Lee, and I'll try to keep this quick because I know we're running a little behind, but I just wanted to stress the importance of having proper protocols in place to provide the linguistic access to your clients. And the best practice is always to have a plan to offer qualified interpreters or a bilingual advocate that your organization provides. And it's the responsibility of your organization or your agency to make sure that this happens. And this could include provisions like recruiting and ensuring staffing of bilingual advocates, training staff to properly interpret and work with interpreters, how to obtain outside interpreters to assist in person and remotely as appropriate. And there should also be contingency plans for less common languages and sufficient resources and funding in place to make sure that you can pay for those language services as needed. One reason this is very important is because you want to be clear that the interpreter is acting as an agent of the attorney. Attorneys have to keep all information related to the client representation confidential, as you know, many of you well know, and professional and properly trained interpreters have a duty to not disclose privileged communications between attorneys and clients, and as a third party, they do not break that confidentiality if they're professionally and properly trained. The next slide. So this question often comes up, why not use friends and family? It can be incredibly appealing to use somebody that the client brings, but there are a number of reasons. First, they may not be trained to interpret. They might not be fully bilingual. They may not know the proper terminology, so there's a risk of a lot of miscommunication. If they're not properly trained also, they may reveal confidential information to others, and so that privilege and confidentiality could be damaged or broken. There also might be lost information because the client could be uncomfortable sharing private details in front of someone they know. Similarly, family and friends may not feel comfortable interpreting sensitive information, so you could lose critical facts. And then, of course, children should never be used unless there is an absolute emergency. So on the next slide, I'll just go over some tips and safeguards. In a practical sense, there are different roles that interpreters can have. There are times where the interpreter may need to play the role of a cultural broker or clarify where there are some misunderstandings, but clearly, first and foremost, the most important and main role is to act as a linguistic conduit so that attorneys can communicate with clients as seamlessly as possible. So this enables clients to communicate their questions and concerns to attorneys directly, attorneys and advocates directly. So one thing you can do is prepare and brief the interpreter before the client arrives. This can include giving them an overview of the case and any potential issues you think may arise. Make sure you review with the interpreter that everything will be kept confidential, and having them sign a confidentiality agreement is a good best practice, and I believe there's a sample in the materials. You should also screen for potential conflicts. Also make sure you allow for extra time and take breaks. And then also go over the interpreter's role with the client once you're all together. And then these are some possible issues that you can look for, and you should consider intervening if some of these issues arise. If there are side conversations between the interpreter and the client, make sure you stop and ask the interpreter to interpret everything that is being said. If the interpreter seems to be giving the client advice or extra information, you should ask the interpreter to refrain from doing this. Also, the interpreter should always be speaking in the first person. And if the client seems confused or you feel like communication is breaking down, you should always have a backup plan, even if it's a telephonic interpreter, so you can explain what happened, possibly reschedule with a different person. And if time is of the essence, you may just have to proceed with your backup plan. Having said all of this, you may have some extreme situations where you have a very rare language, and I mean really rare, where you absolutely cannot find anyone and time is of the essence, and you might have to use someone from the community or another advocate, someone who may not have had the training that you would like them to have. And in this case, you can offer some resources to assist. It's definitely not ideal, but there are videos and materials you can share, even give a mini training to these individuals. But ultimately, if the communication is not occurring, you'll have to try and find a different resource. And just one last thing, if you do end up using someone who may be affiliated with another community group or social service organization, make sure you discuss any mandated reporter obligations that may arise, which are different from state to state. The next few slides, I'll just go over quickly. It's an example of our own LEP policy and procedures. Every organization should have something like this that covers that addresses each of these elements. This is just an outline of our policy and procedures. On the next slide, if you're LSC funded, there is a requirement to have such a plan in place, and you can look at that link. The guidance came out in 2004. And then finally, on the next slide, there are other statutory mandates if you're federally funded or you're using any kind of federal money. You know, there are mandates under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In different states, they might have a state version, a similar version of Title VI, and then there's obviously other sort of model rules that you can look at under the EBA and other standards, and then also your state ethical obligations under professional responsibility may mandate you to also ensure that you're providing proper language access to communicate with your clients, keep them informed, and not to discriminate on the basis of language. So that's language access in a nutshell.
So as our previous speaker, Hillary, had mentioned, there is such a wide diversity of backgrounds across human trafficking populations. So it's important to have processes within an organization to ensure cultural responsiveness of all staff. It's important to consider cultural factors such as religious beliefs, attitude towards sex, gender roles, social customs, to better identify trafficking survivors and to better provide services. And as I mentioned before, that also goes hand in hand with a trauma-informed approach. So we encourage our advocates when they come into contact with a client, and if they're taking on that case, to learn about the client's culture themselves so that they could respond appropriately. In addition, we make contact with other cultural NGOs if appropriate, and for example, also the LGBT centers if the client is an LGBT client, so that the client is fully seen and heard. And lastly, one of our greatest partners is CAST, which we partnered back in the early 2000s. We collaborated to create the first Los Angeles Human Trafficking Task Force together with the U.S. Attorney and LAPD. Together, we've given regional trainings and technical assistance, and we refer almost all of our social service needs and shelter needs to CAST, who's also sub-grantee on one of our grants and does a lot of this domestic human trafficking work. So we're very grateful for that partnership here with LAFLA. Attached are some other resources that are in PDF format.
Great. Thank you, Joanne and Dahlia. And we'll hand it over now to Stephanie with CAST to share a little bit about the role and activities of her organization. Stephanie?
Yes, my name is Stephanie Richard. I'm the Policy and Legal Services Director for the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, otherwise known as CAST, and I've been at CAST for 12 years, and we have collaborated over those years with many legal aids, including LAFLA, as well as public defenders and law enforcement partners. So I'm going to review that really quickly now. Next slide. So at CAST, we're really lucky, and this is probably the type of service provider you would want to locate in your community, in that we have comprehensive services in-house, which include a 24-hour emergency response with both our legal and social service providers, in-house legal services, social services, a survivor leadership program, and policy and outreach and training. Next slide. I can't stress enough how important it is to be able to meet trafficking survivors when they're ready, and that includes responding to law enforcement, but also to calls from other service providers and or clients themselves who are just getting out of their trafficking situation. And so we offer these services on the ground. And what we find is that if you're not able to respond immediately to many trafficking survivors, they return to their traffickers. Next slide. Again, our perspective is that you can't necessarily help this vulnerable population without what we call intensive case management. We find that it's very difficult as a lawyer to engage in for a client to engage in any legal services without these kind of wraparound services that are listed here. Next slide. And the other thing we offer at CAST, and is probably the greatest resource for those on the phone, is we do have 2 full-time attorneys who answer questions in all different areas of law for both legal and social service providers around trafficking-related issues. It is a national technical assistance and training program. The information is there. And we also will have online in May 16 hours of e-learning that's very specialized for attorneys and social service providers. There's 6 hours available now if you go to our website at CAST LA and look at e-learning. For those attorneys on there, if you're in California, it's already accredited for MCLE credit, but also if you do the training, it's set up so that you can apply with your own state bar to receive credit. So please feel free to reach out and to our technical assistance and training program. Next slide. And so in-house, our services are only for trafficking survivors. So if you are not a trafficking survivor, we can't screen you. But if you are a trafficking survivor, then we try to provide all the legal advocacy that a client needs, which means that a client can be in all 3 court systems at once, immigration, criminal, and they can have their own criminal defense issues or their own criminal victim witness issues, and civil. And so this is sort of a listing of the wraparound services that we provide. Next slide. And I think one of the important things that we try to highlight to our law enforcement partners and others is that, you know, this is just the kind of the framework of how we have the legal service provider interacting with all the systems that a trafficking survivor is really interacting with on their legal issues. And there is this tension sometimes that we see come out between, you know, what's the client's most important goal and then what might be the criminal justice system goal. And so our job is to sort of remind our close partners of all the issues that a client may be facing. Next slide. We also train and support a lot of our legal services work through a pretty rigorous pro bono program. And each of these cases is particularly time intensive, and so we try to expand our capacity by working with pro bonos. I do have to say that there's a lot of information out there that you can like pro bonos can just do the work. And what we found is we co-counsel with every case we place with pro bonos because that technical expertise and that victim-centered approach is much harder to kind of train and oversee with your pro bono attorneys. And so how have we collaborated with legal services organizations in the past? So I do want to be clear that the good news is that there's good memorandum, even for our undocumented clients, that all trafficking victims can be served by legal aid. And so CAST and LawFlaw have worked together for years, and this is because CAST often has a wait list of 50 to 100 survivors, so we're just trying to find as many resources for people as possible. And so we found that our legal aid folks are already really well set up to meet a lot of the existing needs of human trafficking survivors if they identify them, right? And so, you know, as Lasla talked about, they have these specialized units that if we do an intake and see specific legal issues that Lasla already has expertise in, we will refer to them. The other partnership that Dalia already briefly spoke about is that in 2005, we launched collaboratively the first human trafficking task force in the country, and that original partnership was with CAS and LAFLA, as well as the AUSA's office and LAPD, and that model has continued through this year, although it's transferred to the Sheriff's Office. And, you know, just something to pitch to you guys, we've also collaborated in receiving funding. So the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime gives specialized grants for legal service providers. And so LAFLA and CAS have received that grant since 2010, and this has allowed us to provide ongoing direct services for human trafficking victims, as well as train other legal aid organizations to provide those services. Next slide. And then, as important as our collaboration with legal aid has been our collaboration with public defenders. You know, we are truly victims' rights attorneys. However, we do find that one of our closest allies for our clients is our public defender partners, because so many of our clients have faced criminal arrest and conviction and not been identified as trafficking victims, because many victims are criminalized for crimes their traffickers force them to commit. And I do want to stress that I think there's more public understanding that this happens in the sex trafficking context with prostitution, but I just want to say that we see this also regularly with our labor trafficking cases, who are forced to sell and cultivate drugs, forced to smuggle drugs at the border, forced to commit benefit fraud issues for the benefits of their traffickers, and the list goes on. So this is truly a unique issue in the anti-trafficking area, where you have the commercial exploitation also being a criminal act, and then the victim of that crime actually having committed every element of the crime, right? And then the trafficker actually exploiting that vulnerability and using that against them. And so one thing that we've experienced is that, you know, it takes a lot of work and energy to build that relationship of trust with public defenders, so that even if a client has very strict criminal liability, we're able to sort of educate and have the right contacts to make sure that the full information, if the client wants it, comes out, and that usually, you know, results in charges being dismissed against that client, but also the true perpetrator getting charged. So things that we've done with our public defenders have been, we've worked with public defenders who have been designated as the material witnesses, as the attorneys as material witnesses to do victim witness advocacy for human trafficking victims. We've helped them understand the specialized immigration benefits that only trafficking victims can get. I think there's a lot more understanding about U visas than T visas, and that information has needed to be out there. We have a specialized, we actually drafted and had passed here in California specialized criminal reentry provisions for human trafficking survivors that allow for sealing of arrest records and convictions, and we're working now with our public defender partners to implement it. It just went into effect last year, and we helped draft also an affirmative defense that was passed in California specifically for trafficking victims that some of our public defender allies are now using in criminal cases. CAS does provide expert testimony, and we've done it for both our prosecutor friends as well as public defenders, depending on if the charge is against the victim. And we also will do, we can't do criminal defense work, but we do advocacy in the court systems to get charges dismissed as well as warrants cleared. And one of the most interesting relationships we've developed is with the LA City Attorney. And we spent like 4 years working with the head of the criminal division. And again, these are misdemeanor cases. But basically, we have this deal that if a public defender reaches out to CAS and says they have likely identified a trafficking victim, we have this basic form and information that the city attorney has said is, if we confirm that the crime is directly related to the trafficking and fill out this form, they will dismiss the charges, and it's a centralized process against that client just based on CAS's word. We call it the attorney certification letter. And again, it streamlines all of our processes because it's this position of trust where the PDs are reaching out to us and the LA City Attorney's Office sees us as an independent third party. If we don't assess that someone is a trafficking victim or the crime is related, we just don't, we won't share any information with the city attorney, and it's done only with the permission of the PDs. Next slide. And then, one of our central roles as victims' attorneys is to assist this population who has often had not great experiences with law enforcement, reporting to law enforcement. And that sometimes does create tension because a lot of times our law enforcement partners won't understand that it's a process for a client to report to law enforcement. And so, our training for all attorneys across the country talks about, how do you support a client in that process, but also in a trauma-informed, victim-centered approach. The other thing that I just like to note is that because a lot of times clients' stories do change just because of the trauma or that it was over a long period of time, we really, when we report cases to law enforcement, we have a really basic check-the-box page so that we're not creating conflicting records. So you can go on to the next slide. And I'm not going to go over these, but I like to highlight that, it's a huge barrier that we as attorneys help our clients bypass when they are reporting to law enforcement. So these are some of the common concerns we hear from our human trafficking clients, and then how we advise around it. Next slide. And then CAST, after we've reported and worked with law enforcement, CAST continues to work with law enforcement and acts as a liaison between law enforcement and the client. We accompany them for all interviews. And, if it's what the client wants, we also help with a lot of the evidence collection. And so we are that bridge between law enforcement and the client. Next slide. And then, as I said, we host the Los Angeles Regional Trafficking Task Force. And so this is if you go to the next slide, you can just see the structure of it. And it does help us collaborate with our civil legal service providers, as well as our social service partners, as well as our law enforcement partners at the federal and state level. And it is a pretty, this area is a very complicated area, but I highlight the task force model because if you're new to the issue of trafficking, one of the ways to figure out the best service providers or legal providers would be to get in touch with the task force and figure out who is the service provider designee of that task force. And there's various ones throughout all the states. Next slide. And then just finally, I did want to just plug the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. So their job is to connect victims or service providers or public defenders or whoever needs information about trafficking in specific states. So like, for example, many of the calls that go to the National Human Trafficking Hotline that are for California come to CAST, right? But it is hard, especially if you're new to this issue, to vet what's going on and who's the best resources. And so starting there and then going from there to figure out what the resources are in your state. If you are in California, CAST does run a 24-hour hotline that does referrals throughout the state of California. And then finally, I just want to, again, pitch our technical assistance program. In addition to offering individualized case-specific advice, We also offer weekly calls for attorneys and monthly calls for social service providers to call in and ask case-specific questions. And finally, if you take one of our e-learning class trainings, you get access to what we call our box documents. So I know LAFLA has provided 10 to 12 resources that will be on the website, but our box has over 900 documents that are specific for trafficking and are based on our 10 years of legal services for this population. And so, as I said, can be seen as a resource, but are only accessible if you do take one of our e-learning classes. So that is everything, and I know we had very little time, so I'm sorry to take so much of it.
No worries. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And next, again, thank you to everyone who's with us still. We are bumping up right on that 3:30 timeline, but next we'll hear from Zoe Root, who will share some of her background working in the public defense sector and criminal defense. So I'll hand it over to Zoe.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for those of you who are holding on past our 3:30 end time. I have to say it is so heartening to hear Hillary speaking about victim-centeredness and Dahlia describing the potential for survivor healing through the client-attorney relationship, Joanne speaking about the importance of client confidentiality, and Stephanie talking about meeting clients where they're at. These are all really the building blocks that make it possible for meaningful collaboration between prosecutors and defenders who represent survivors of trafficking. Every step of the process of building a relationship with survivors of trafficking has to include a recognition of the trauma that those survivors have endured, both at the hands of their traffickers and at the hands of the justice system itself. As Ariel mentioned, I'm Zoe Root, and speaking both in my capacity as Senior Policy Counsel at the Justice Programs Office at American University, and based on my experience as a supervising attorney at the Bronx Defenders and in the Bronx County Human Trafficking Intervention Court. As a defender at the Bronx Defenders, I experienced firsthand that public defenders are uniquely situated to identify victims of human trafficking, as they are often the first advocates assigned to a trafficking victim when they have been arrested for prostitution-related offenses, drug-related offenses, or otherwise. On that note, I'll mention that while I'm going to be talking about the Human Trafficking Intervention Court in the Bronx, which focuses solely on clients who are arrested for prostitution-related offenses, sex trafficking is not the only type of trafficking, and public defenders are uniquely situated to identify survivors of labor trafficking as well. So one note that I'll make on the use of screening tools, there are really useful screening tools for identifying victims of human trafficking. The Vera Institute of Justice released the first validated and reliable tool in identifying victims of sex and labor trafficking in 2014. But I will caution that it would be a mistake for us to rely too heavily on the results of a screening tool alone. The identification of a trafficking survivor is not as simple as going through a checklist, which was really one of the most important messages that I'm hoping to get across, that the most important factor in identifying a victim of human trafficking is to build a strong, solid, trusting relationship with the client before ever mentioning the word trafficking. Survivors of trafficking have often been through experiences that parallel those of domestic violence survivors. Their relationships with their traffickers are dangerous and traumatic and complicated, and divulging information about their traffickers can put their safety in jeopardy. I know as a public defender, I had a client whose trafficker broke her jaw when she tried to leave him. We have to trust that these clients are experts on their own safety, and we have to follow their lead about what information they are comfortable sharing, when, how, and to whom. To that end, the topic of trafficking is not the type that you bring up at an arraignment interview when the client has been through the trauma of arrest and been in lockup and hasn't eaten or slept for 18 hours. The conversation about trafficking almost never happens in the first or the second or the third meeting, and sometimes doesn't happen for weeks or months or years into knowing that client. The Bronx Defenders is a holistic public defender office that provides client-centered services, including criminal representation, civil representation, family representation, social workers, investigators, and client advocates for all of their clients. Bronx Defenders attorneys and advocates are trained to be client-centered and to build a trusting relationship with every single client, not for the purposes of screening for human trafficking, but because it is the best practice in providing quality public defense. A core component of being client-centered is having holistic services available to all clients and not to give special treatment to one group of clients over another. So the Bronx Defenders screens for and addresses all needs across the board, regardless of why the client came through their doors. So Bronx Defenders attorneys will assign a housing attorney to a client whether they need help finding housing because they're trying to escape their trafficker or if they are facing eviction proceedings. Regardless of the legal issue that a client is experiencing and why it exists, the Bronx Defenders is there to represent them. So that brings me to the topic of the Bronx County Human Trafficking Intervention Court, which started in, oh, can we go back one slide? Sorry. Great, thanks. So the Bronx County Human Trafficking Intervention Court started in 2013. The Chief Judge of New York State identified 11 jurisdictions where he wanted human trafficking intervention courts to open, and Bronx County was one of them. It was based on a specialized court model, and there was an evolving philosophy throughout the court over the years. And when it first started, there were growing pains. I know when I first started representing clients in the Bronx County Human Trafficking Intervention Court, there were prosecutors who were offering my clients charged with prostitution jail time based on their previous criminal record. And I often thought, well, what are we doing here in a specialized court if, you know, all we're doing is business as usual? And it also took a while for the prosecutors to understand that getting a client to the point of a trafficking disclosure takes a very long time, and that building the relationship between clients and public defenders takes time, getting to the point of disclosure to the public defender takes time, and getting clients permission to share that information with the prosecution takes plenty more time. I'll say another thing that I took a while to establish was for the prosecution to understand that public defenders' loyalty is to their clients first. When my clients would disclose that they were trafficked, my first question was always, what can I do to help keep you safe? It was never, hey, can you tell me the name of your trafficker and can I tell the prosecutor on your case about it? Once the prosecutors I was working with came to understand that, the collaboration was a lot easier, and we came to really build an incredible space of healing and care for our clients. Over time, and to the credit of the stakeholders involved, we built a common philosophy that made for a much kinder, gentler courtroom. The court officers were trained to call our trans-identified clients by their chosen name, not the name on their rap sheet. And prosecutors began proposing dispositions that were far more favorable for the clients. And there was a feeling that everyone in the courtroom was bonded by a common goal, which was the safety and well-being of the clients involved. And that in and of itself made the clients trust the process more and built the trusting relationship necessary for the trafficking disclosure to occur. In most cases, clients were offered what's called an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal if they agreed to engage in services with Bronx Community Solutions. Bronx Community Solutions is an excellent organization based in the Bronx Courthouse where they truly met clients where they were at, and they provided clients with everything from intensive psychiatric services and counseling to help working on their resume if that was their greatest need. The services were offered to every single client charged with prostitution, regardless of whether or not they had made a disclosure about being trafficked, which was a really important building block to the trust that we were able to build in that courtroom. One of the biggest strengths of the Bronx County Human Trafficking Intervention Court was that the prosecution understands that building a relationship with the client is an incremental process. Providing clients with good services and fairness and treating them with integrity will increase the likelihood that they will trust the players they're in, even if it doesn't lead to a trafficking disclosure immediately. One thing that's also important for prosecutors to recognize is that if the reason they are meeting a survivor of trafficking is because that survivor has been arrested, the prosecution is going to be at a disadvantage when they're trying to get those same survivors to cooperate in the prosecution of traffickers. If a prosecutor represents the law enforcement entity that has arrested and charged the client with a crime, they're going to be going up a very steep uphill battle, gaining the client's trust about anything, let alone sharing intimate details about their trafficking experience. One of the critical aspects of the Human Trafficking Intervention Court that made building that trust with prosecutors possible was the prosecutors' involvement in the Human Trafficking Intervention Court Prostitution Conviction Vacature Project. And we can go to the next slide. So the Bronx Defenders Prostitution Conviction Vacature Project started also in 2013. It utilizes criminal procedure law. Oh, that's wrong. I'm sorry. It's the prostitution conviction vacature law that allows for clients who have been the victims of human trafficking to vacate convictions off their record if they can show that those convictions were accrued as the result of being a victim of human trafficking. One of the most powerful parts of the Bronx County Human Trafficking Intervention Court was the prosecution consenting to these motions that were filed. They allowed for truly transformative experiences for clients and for the attorneys involved, both the public defenders and the prosecutors. And it was truly the closest thing to restorative justice that I ever witnessed in the Bronx County Courthouse. Through these motions, the prosecutors had my clients come in for interviews with them and had the opportunity to hear firsthand what their experience had been like being the victims of trafficking. And then the prosecutors were able to speak from experience and from their hearts when the court date came around, and they took the stance that they were going to consent to the motion, for the client's convictions to be vacated. And that was it was truly beautiful moments that came as a result of the Human Trafficking Intervention Court Prostitution Conviction Vacature Project. So that is just one tool in the toolbox that prosecutors have when they are trying to build the potential trust with victims of human trafficking. And I think I can wrap it up there. I just want to end by saying anyone on the webinar who wants to should feel free to reach out to me. We at the Justice Programs Office at American University are working to identify ways we can fulfill the needs of the field within the human trafficking survivor advocate community. And thank you so much, Emily and Ariel, for having me.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Hi, everyone. This is Ariel again from NOADA. And I will briefly be talking about federal funding and resources to support this important work. But right after my short section, we will have a few minutes for Q&A, so please remember to get any last-minute questions into the chat box. So again, there's not time today to go into an exhaustive list, but I did want to highlight a few really promising opportunities, particularly on the civil side for serving survivors of human trafficking. First, from the DOJ Office for Victims of Crime, which is the office that manages the largest amount of funding dedicated to providing services to these survivors, which was more than $8 million in that pot in 2017. There's 3 particular anti-trafficking programs where this is the main focus, and one of which Stephanie mentioned is funding task legal aid training as well. So these 3 are comprehensive services, specialized services, and the enhanced collaborative model. So all 3 of these present opportunities where your work can be funded, but we're seeing the specialized services for victims of human trafficking being the program where it's really the best fit for legal aid to apply as primary grantees, whereas the other 2 are more appropriate for legal aid to partner with other organizations doing this work and can receive funding as a sub-grantee. So we're expecting to see solicitations for human trafficking in the next few months. Typically they come out between January and March. We're waiting to hear a little more, but definitely keep your eyes open for these to come out for the next cycle of funding. So next, I wanted to highlight legal assistance for victims from the Office on Violence Against Women. And many of you are familiar with LAV as a significant funding stream for legal aid. It funds direct legal services to victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And while these are broader services than serving survivors of trafficking, I did want to highlight that the FY 2018 solicitation, which just closed last week, includes human trafficking as a priority area. And this is new, so I did want to point that out. And if you're doing this work and you're not able to apply this time around, certainly keep this in mind for future cycles of LAV to look out for this human trafficking language. And finally, I wanted to highlight that Equal Justice Works recently announced their application for the Crime Victims Justice Court Fellowship Program. And this is an exciting new OVC-funded program which will fund 45 legal fellows to serve human trafficking survivors. The application for host sites are due March 14th, and we encourage everyone to apply who thinks that you could benefit from having a legal fellow add some capacity to your organization. And I included Allie Yang Green's contact info here if you want to learn more, or you can check out Equal Justice Works website. So again, this is by no means an exhaustive list, and while these are the areas where we expect there to be the biggest focus on human trafficking in terms of federal grants in the coming year, there are certainly other funding streams, particularly through OVC and OVW, and in the past through Department of Health and Human Services, that funds has broader purpose areas, but also has the potential to fund supportive services for survivors of trafficking, similar to the LAV example. So if you're interested in discussing this in more depth and you'd like some additional guidance, please feel free to reach out to me after the webinar.
Great. Thank you, Ariel. And as
Ariel mentioned at the beginning of our presentation today, I'll restate that all of our presenters today have very generously offered their contact information so that anyone who's participating today can reach out to them with specific questions after the fact. So we'll move through the bios quickly now, but again, please do reach out to these experts should you have follow-up questions. So moving into our Q&A session for today's webinar. We have a few questions that have come in already, but again, as we're moderating the Q&A, I do invite our participants to continue to add those questions through the Q&A function of WebEx or the chat box. Right now, I'll go ahead and unmute our presenters so that they're able to respond to these questions as we move forward. Now, our first question comes from Sarah, who wants to know how you would recommend working with victims who don't identify as victims of trafficking or who aren't ready to identify as such.
This is Dalia. I think that obviously we want to respect the clients and, you know, as they say in the social work school, to meet the client where they're at. I think that if you look in the resources in the toolkit, the Adult Human Trafficking Screening Tool is really amazing at getting to identification. But you're right that even once we've identified, it's still up to the client, you know, whether they want to be seen as a human trafficking survivor and whether they then want the accompanying services or not. But I encourage you to take an in-depth look at the screening tool. Because in a non-judgmental way, it can help somebody be identified. And of course, also it takes a lot of explaining to the client, you know, about human trafficking. Like you may have to explain to the client, him or herself, what human trafficking is and, you know, what that means legally and socially.
And this is Stephanie from CAS. So, I mean, again, let's remember that you can hear facts as the lawyer that means that you identify someone as a human trafficking victim, and it doesn't matter if they don't identify as a victim. What we do is we can explain the benefits and protections that they could be eligible for, just given the facts of what happened. So I do feel like sometimes the term trafficking victim, you know, or even victim, him or itself, is something that's hard for this population to embrace because they feel sometimes that they have been complicit in the trafficking and or, you know, as was talked about, you know, don't identify it as victimization. How we deal with it is explaining, you know, what steps they can choose to take given what has happened to them and not having to categorize it. I mean, the more difficult thing for us is when someone won't give, like, isn't ready to talk about the facts that would show the trafficking, and I think then they have to be ready.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Stephanie's saying. This is Hillary from the law enforcement perspective. We don't actually ever need the victim to say, I am a victim of human trafficking. For instance, if a person were to come to you as a client who had been arrested in a prostitution-related situation, if you start to get, as Stephanie said, the facts of what happened and, you know, who collects the money from the clients, is there a certain amount you're expected to make per day? What happens if you don't show up for a date? Is there someone who you're supposed to text when you start and finish with a client? You start to get the facts of the day in the life of this person, and you can see if somebody else is controlling their life or even their work or their services in the commercial sex context. Same with the labor trafficking victim. A lot of these cases that are our best prosecutions where we prove trafficking beyond reasonable doubt, they start with a person being arrested for stealing a candy bar. Then they come to a criminal defense attorney and, you know, it just doesn't make any sense. Well, were you hungry? Okay, so what do you usually eat? Oh, you don't really speak English. Well, let's get an interpreter. Let's figure this out. And it turns out to be a domestic servant left in the home when the family goes out of the country and leaves her with very little food, and she's, you know, now stealing food from the Walmart. And it just doesn't make any sense without digging deeper. So it's going to be something like that. It's going to be someone in commercial sex with these indicators that somebody else is controlling the whole interaction and the earnings, or somebody in a labor situation who's going to say, oh, well, I owe a debt to the employer. And many of the Mexican sex trafficking victims we've worked with, if you were to ask them what's been going on in their life, they would say, well, my husband told me we have a family emergency, so I have to make money for a short time, and, you know, we're going to build a house together and sail off into the sunset. Like, they still think everything's good. So they would not be ready to use the word human trafficking victim. If we start to see the indicators that somebody's controlling their life and controlling all the proceeds that they're generating, that's where we're in a position to spot that. And it may or may not be at all helpful to apply the term trafficking victim to them at that juncture, or really ever. It's a conclusion we as lawyers draw from the facts that we see, and we're the ones connecting the dots, not them.
Great. Right, and I totally just want to echo everything that has already been said. This is Zoe, and remind everyone that, you know, the survivors of human trafficking are the experts in their own needs. So if you're looking for ways to serve them, whether or not they've identified themselves as a victim, is really just to ask them what you can do for them and what sort of services they need, and connecting them to those services. As others have already said, there's really no need to put a label on it in order to provide the services they need.
Wonderful, thank you. And we're getting a lot of questions about the slides and resources and contact information. So for those of you still on the webinar, of course, all of our presenters' contact information are up on the screen now. Slides for this presentation will be posted by the end of this week, and we'll be posting a video recording with captioning of this presentation within the next, I would say, 2 weeks. Additionally, all of the attachments that we've alluded to will be uploaded to NLADA's website, again, by the end of this week. From another participant on today's call, Clementine is curious about whether the vacation of convictions process is available nationwide, or if not, if there are other expungement options for lawyers who are working with victims of trafficking and experiencing this need to expunge particular convictions.
Sure. Well, this is Zoe, and I'm happy to take a stab at that and invite others to jump in. So unfortunately, the vacatur of human trafficking or of prostitution convictions is not available nationwide, and it's really determined on a state-by-state basis. So depending on what state you live in, I would encourage you to look into the vacatur and expungement options in your jurisdiction. They are becoming more and more common nationwide, and they do vary from state to state. So I would encourage you to look into what the laws are in your particular jurisdiction.
And this is Stephanie from CAS. I'm sending this link out. So CAS has this specialized technical assistance program to consult on legal services for trafficking victims, but the secondary project that was funded the same year is hosted by the American Bar Association, and they actually have specialized funding to help with national TA on criminal reentry work for trafficking survivors nationwide. So on their website, there is a map that shows all the different state laws, you know, as Zoe pointed out, all the states are different. I want to be really clear that a good state vacatur law is going to vacate a wide range of crimes, not just prostitution. In California, it is all nonviolent offenses, and it will not have all the same terms that like regular expungement requires. A lot of times, like, so you don't have to complete probation, right? Or you don't have to pay the fines and fees with these types of provisions. And for us, it was also important in California that it's not just the conviction that's vacated, but the arrest record is sealed as part of our specialized law, because in California, the only other way you can steal an arrest record is with a finding of factual innocence. But again, every single state is going to have a slightly different policy, and that's what this national TA program is designed to do. And I should say we also, in our box net of 900 documents, we have a lot of templates in this area for motions and things like that as well that we've been compiling.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I will circulate that link to all attendees just a moment. From another one of our participants, Josh, he is currently a law student and very interested in this topic and area of work, and he's wondering if any of our presenters have career path recommendations for law students who are interested in working more closely in this topic area.
This is Stephanie. So we work with a lot of law students and young attorneys, and you know, my advice is that you should have some kind of specialization in immigration practice, criminal, and or family law. These are the most common issues that we see come up for our clients, and so when we're looking to hire someone, we're looking for those specialized skill sets, because it's very difficult to hire anyone who has human trafficking background. So, you know, at least at CAST, we're training for the trafficking lens, but we're looking for that legal skill set.
Wonderful, and I know that we're going really deep into this conversation because I think it's such a passion point for so many of us. But we'll have one more question out to our presenters, and this is from Kimberly, and she's looking for any feedback about how to sensitively handle cases involving individuals who are charged with trafficking being born out of that same background of exploitation, and any recommendations for how these kinds of cases need to be prosecuted with certain sensitivity.
This is Stephanie again, and this is something, you know, we've kind of realized early on, and it's something I train my younger attorneys on, is this idea that a lot of times the trafficker can be a family member and or a close personal relationship, and so the person's feeling, especially for family, is something that doesn't change. And it's also highly connected to their community. And so I think a lot of times people think the solution is to like put trafficking survivors in locations out of state, or, you know, just kind of put them in these lockdown facilities so they have a period where they can, you know, reflect on their exploitation. And what we've found in CAST experience on the ground is that, you know, it's a personal process to understand the exploitation that has happened to you, and that every person really wants to be with their family and part of their community. And you can help them come up with safety plans, and you can assert legal rights and protections and put those in place, but you can't change that personal perspective that no one really wants to be cut off from their family and their community. And we have to be able to provide our services with that lens in mind.
Yeah, and
Wonderful.
This is Zoe. I just want to reiterate that, and to mention that, you know, whether or not the trafficker is a family member, oftentimes clients have very complicated relationships with their trafficker, and that respecting the bounds of that relationship and where it is going to go is something that only the client can dictate, and it's not something for the attorney to make decisions about. That, as we've been saying so many times, that it's really important to recognize where the client is at, and what sorts of disclosures they're ready to make, and for them to have a really true understanding of what that means for the life of their trafficker.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And again, thank you to all of our presenters today. This is definitely a topic that has resulted in a really vigorous Q&A session, and I think we could go on much longer. But with respect to everyone's time, I'll thank everyone for their participation today as a presenter and as an attendee or audience member. Again, we'll post these slides from today's presentation by the end of the week, and you can expect this video to be posted to our website within the next 2 weeks, and we'll include all of the resources and materials that our presenters alluded to at the same time as those slides are posted. So thank you again to everyone who's joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next training or webinar event.